As you may,
I'm so sorry.
as you may or may not know, this is a fairly new type of project for the county, and so we're still ironing out what the ideal project looks like and what kind of projects we want to come see towards the bond, and we're hoping that this meeting can help guide some of that conversation. So for this meeting, just to give you a rundown of where we're going to go, first I have a short presentation of the bond itself and specifically getting into the definitions of passive recreation lands. And then we're going to pause for some larger discussion around that. And then finally, we do have an activity. There's posters around the room that we'd love to have you guys engage in to help move things forward. But first things first, I would love to introduce the team that is working on this bond. So for those of you I haven't met yet, I am Jill Carter and I'm the project manager for the Open Space Bond. So I'm responsible for making sure that we're making progress in terms of getting things, getting criteria decided, getting the applications launched. And once we select projects, I'll be the one leading kind of the oversight of those projects and the kind of administration of them as well. And I just joined the county back in February, so I'm fairly new, but excited to be here. And I'll let the team introduce themselves. Y'all can just go in order your pictures. That's easy.
Oh, I'm Allison Bates. I'm the director for Parks and Recreation. Pardon my allergies. I've been here for just over a year now, so I'm very excited to see you all here and have this conversation.
And I'm Jennifer Harrison. I'm the Ag and Land Resources Director, which is Extension and Soil and Water. And our portion, the expertise of our team, which is also Ariel and Avni, who are not with us tonight, are on the easement side. So we help do the ag easements, and then we engage with the Land Conservation Advisory Board for the land trust side of conservation easements.
Thomas Dole, I'm the principal park planner for Oklahoma County. Came from state parks to work here. So I'm familiar with the park type because a lot of the state parks actually have designated nature reserves on them as well. So it's very similar in nature to the passive recreation parks.
Thank you. So as an overview, I'm just several of you are familiar with a little bit of a recap, but the Open Space Bond was one of two general obligation bonds voted for this past year. And this bond allocates $30 million towards three types of projects. These are conservation easements, as Jennifer just mentioned, greenways, and passive recreation lands. These funds are going to be made available for projects for the next 7 years, with the possibility to extend to 10 years. But for each of these project types, we are running them under their own application process, whereby the team will receive project proposals, evaluate them against a set of criteria, and then an advisory board for each project type will review the projects and make recommendations of which projects should move forward. And then finally, the commissioners have the final say on selecting which projects will actually receive bond funding. Currently, our team is in step one. We are hard at work developing the evaluation criteria for each of these project types. Conservation easements actually had their criteria adopted by the commissioners last week, so we can start moving into the project review phase for them. Greenways, we just had the criteria approved by the Recreation Advisory Board, and we anticipate going to the commissioners for adoption in June. And then finally, for passive recreation lands, we are getting started. We've been having a lot of great conversations internally as a team and also with the commissioners around this process. And we're excited to start talking with stakeholders and talking with the public, working with our advisory board to start figuring out what this is going to look like. As I said towards the beginning of the presentation, we are using this month or so to really engage around what's the vision for passive recreation? What kind of projects do we want to see come forward? What makes a good passive recreation project? And what are the opportunities? Who do we need to engage in this process? Where are there areas for collaboration? Based on these conversations, we are then going to be developing a set of criteria that incorporates this public and stakeholder feedback. We will take that draft criteria to our advisory board as well as to the stakeholders to get additional input and feedback. And then finally, we hope to bring a final set of criteria to our advisory board and commissioners for adoption later this summer. And then we will be able to open an application window for project proposals, ideally this fall, and go into project selection in the spring of next year. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is getting into that definition of passive recreation, but I did want to pause and see if there were any questions around the process for the bond or specifically this timeline for criteria development for passive recreation.
Do you want to mention the advisory board, how they're together?
Oh, yes, thank you. So, as Jennifer just alluded to, so we do have an advisory board for each component of the bond that is responsible for reviewing these projects, helping guide the process of designing criteria and application process. For greenways, it's the Recreation Advisory Board. For conservation easements, it's a combination of the Land Conservation Advisory Boards reviewing those land trust brought forward conservation easements, and then the Agricultural Advisory Board reviewing agricultural easements. And then for this component, we have a combination of those two. We have a subcommittee that includes members from both boards, and they are responsible for providing that advisory role for passive recreation.
I mean, two board members here tonight.
Kevin and Ann are both on that subcommittee. So yeah, any questions about the process before we get into kind of the meatier conversation?
This may be a way down the line question, but if there was a project for, let's say like a conservation easement, it was granted, and then eventually that conservation wanted to be turned into some sort of putting trails there, passive rec, would it be the same application process? Like it kind of goes through both rounds, do you know what I mean?
So we are going to only allow projects to apply to one component of the bond. So obviously the county does fund conservation easements with other funding as well. So it might be possible that one of those projects would want to apply for passive recreation bond funding. But otherwise, if they're looking to apply for conservation bond funding or passive recreation bond funding, they are welcome to apply to both, but they'll only be able to receive funding from one. Yeah. And that's going to be kind of an internal process of deciding, is this a better fit for conservation easements? Is it a better fit for passive recreation? And then we would move it along the process if it is selected to move forward based on that. Cool. Yeah.
Do we land on caps?
On caps?
No.
We have not landed on caps. I think, so Jennifer's just asking if we have like a cap for funding. We have not decided on that answer yet. I think the conversation has been leaning away from it, but that decision will be made. Great. So passive recreation lands, again, is very new to the county. And one question I know I've received in every single meeting, and I'm sure the others and staff have as well, is what is passive recreation lands? And I think as we go into talking about the goals for this bond, it's important that we really get these boundaries around defining this component. And as such, our definition is that passive recreation lands are land, outdoor space, water bodies, and corridors where passive recreational activities place minimal stress on a site's resources in a designated area. This is a pretty heavy definition, but the way that we are thinking about it is this is kind of a combination between conservation projects and recreation projects. Most of these eligible projects will include conservation easements, and those easements are there to protect the natural resources, to provide ecosystem service benefits, but they will be required to open access to the public for recreation, and specifically passive recreation, which passive recreation you can kind of think of as activities that really place minimal stress on the resources. These are things that are compatible with conservation, like hiking, wildlife viewing, photography, and as such. Now, that's still a pretty broad definition, so it's also helpful to think about what is not passive recreation, which actually the opposite is called active recreation, go figure. And that would be a structured activity that requires the use of special facilities, courses, fields, or equipment. So these are going to be things like team sports like baseball or soccer or something like golf and skateboarding, where there's a specific infrastructure that has to be put in place, and those infrastructure typically require the destruction of the natural landscape in order to put it in. There also tend to be fairly maintenance intensive, and these can also include activities that, while they might not have a specific infrastructure, are just pretty destructive to the landscape. So like motorized biking would be one where it's more likely to cause destruction. So those are all things that are not passive recreation. And just to give some examples of what this can look like, one in our county is Collier Cove. If you haven't been, it's about 30 acres, but it includes trails that go through these meadows. They have lots of scenic views. This project includes activities like hiking or nature viewing. There's other than a small parking lot and some signage, there's very little like built improvements on the land. So it's very compatible with kind of that conservation goal. And as Thomas alluded to in his introduction, a lot of these passive recreation projects are commonly known as nature preserves. And so if you think of nature preserves you might have seen in other areas, they might very well fall into this category.
I would also say it's important to recognize that this doesn't mean no maintenance. So things like invasive species, trail maintenance, all of those kind of things are expected to be done. It's not like get a piece of property and put it on the shelf and let people walk on it, right? So
And there's also park infrastructures.
Yes.
Right, gazebos.
Exactly.
Trees.
Yeah, exactly. So there's definitely a investment and long-term management involved in these properties. It's just the goal is to really have that be compatible with conservation and natural resource protection as opposed to destruction of the natural resources. Another example is Gold Dune Preserve out in Guilford County. This one's fairly similar to Collier Cove, except it also includes some more water features on the preserve, including rock outcroppings. So there's fishing that takes place there, geocaching. And then a third example is actually fairly different from the other two. It's a very large project. It's called Turnip Seed Nature Preserve in Wendell, North Carolina. And that one's over 260 acres. It's a pretty expansive piece of land. And some of while it has the same general natural features as the other two, some of the activities that take place there are more focused on educational opportunities. And this is where we have an opportunity to see programming on these types of lands. So at Turnip Seed Nature Preserve, they tend to have like guided educational walking tours. They have interpretive exhibits. They have gardens that the community can help tend to as well. So now that we've defined passive recreation, we have kind of a shared understanding. I did want to pause and open for some more conversation before we get to that activity that I mentioned earlier. Specifically, we want to hear what questions you guys might have, but also one reason we want to have this stakeholder meeting is we're trying to get an understanding of what appetite stakeholders in the community might have for engaging with this process, what kind of projects different stakeholders might want to bring forward for this bond. As well as, is there appetite for your organizations to potentially own and maintain these projects with bond funding, or is it something that you envision the county would be owning? These types of questions, we're really trying to get a sense of where there's opportunity for collaboration with stakeholders. So I will pause and open for thoughts and questions.
I had a quick thought, with these other counties, and they're specifically this larger one, can we lean on them for like estimates on the maintenance cost of like on a per mile of trail or per acre basis? That would make evaluating future projects a little bit more concrete.
Yeah, and Thomas, I know has done more of these kind of estimates for these types of projects than I have, but I think that's a great idea for going to these other communities. And that's one thing we've been trying to do as well, is reach out to other counties and cities who do passive recreation and learn how they approach it. As far as the cost estimates, that's probably something Thomas can speak better.
Yeah, so yes and no, and that you can get kind of general ideas from the other counties, but we gotta look at geographic regions too, right? So it's not an apples to apples comparison. So we need to find like examples in like a mountains region, kind of a deal to understand like that type of maintenance cost as opposed to low flat land.
Yeah.
Maintenance costs. So yes, there's some of that we're already kind of reaching out and doing for sure.
Other thoughts, questions?
A general question that we've had about passive rec funds is where and for what those funds can be used for, like if it's primarily acquisition, or if there's gonna be an expectation for the funds that that either the applicant or a partner or something would be, you know, conducting a feasibility study and stuff like that, just sort of like what those funds would be earmarked for and how broad that is.
Yeah, so that's a great question. That's a conversation we've had a lot as a team as well. And so the way that we have approached it is acquisitions are certainly something that can apply for these funds, but that's not going to be the only project type. We're also open to project proposals that are requesting funding for, you know, putting trails on a piece of land, or but doesn't require the county to own and manage that land in the long term. And I think part of the reason we want that flexibility is so that if a great project comes along that would ask for the county to acquire the land, we don't want to say, oh, that's not even eligible, but also understanding, you know, funding some of those smaller asks for things like putting trails on a property will probably allow us to fund more projects. And also to the point of long-term maintenance and management, that's something we want to be able to collaborate with other municipalities or other organizations who can help manage that land and own that land in the long term.
But it's important to note that the bond is for 7, max 10 years. There's no long-term maintenance money in the bond. So it's a really great question to think up front on what are you taking on as you launch a project. And so both the establishment of stuff can be put in the bond, the programming side can be put on, the long-term maintenance, this won't be.
But could the shorter term, 3 to 5 year, be put into an application process? Not necessarily that that's how we want to spend the money, but is it a possibility?
I don't know.
I think we
Great question. I think
Yeah.
we need to.
I think that's a good question. I think, you know, what we've clearly outlined is acquisition and programming.
Yeah.
So development of how we would use the passive recreation lands. Good question about short-term maintenance.
So one thing about the acquisition, any project that's solely for acquisition will definitely need to like paint a longer term vision. Because I mean, the public access component to this particular bond batch of money is huge. So we don't want anybody to just acquire the land and then not have any public access to the land. So
That's in the easement side.
Yeah.
yeah, so I mean, if any organization is just applying for acquisition of land, they need to paint that broader kind of vision of how people are gonna get on the property as soon as possible. So,
I think it's a good idea to include like the short-term maintenance in an application or in the funds that are available. I mean, that's what my organization does, is maintains trails, and we're completely volunteer based, but we're like talking with the city of Asheville, for example, about agreements and MOUs that have the potential for some sort of like reimbursement for trail volunteer hours, or for a specific amount of time, you know, like we maintain for this amount of time, then we turn it over to the city who are the actual land managers. So having something like that, which we're happy to be a resource to help like navigate that for you as well.
That'd be great. I think those kinds of potential collaborations and partnerships are something we think are going to be very important especially for this component of the bond, because, you know, to their point, the long-term maintenance and management, is a key piece of how we're looking at these projects, but it's also not something that the bond is gonna fund. So opportunities where we can collaborate with a group like yours are good for us to keep in mind.
But I also think, I mean, we're jumping ahead here, but in that application process, I can't imagine that we wouldn't ask, what is your plan for long-term maintenance?
Yes.
I mean,
Yeah,
to your point, Thomas, I mean, it's not acquire the land and have it open for 2 years and then take it offline. So, so I think there will be some focus somehow on demonstration of resources to maintain over time, or,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know how it'll be worded, but.
So this, I don't wanna cut our discussion short, but part of the activity is talking about some of the things we're looking for in potential projects. And so that plan for long-term maintenance and management is definitely a key conversation that has come up over and over and over again of how are these projects, we don't wanna just fund a project and then for it to fall apart after, you know, the 7-year timeline. So what's the long-term goal for these projects?
How do y'all determine what the county plans and needs are?
So I can actually just go ahead and go into these characteristics because it's obviously very relevant. But so we have been in thinking about, you know, next steps in defining passive recreation lands and what these projects can look like. We've identified these characteristics as like goal values projects. This is what the staff thinks, you know, in looking at these projects, we want to make sure that they address these values. And so I'll quickly run through them, but the first is obviously like minimizing the negative and maximizing the positive conservation environmental impact. That's a key component of the conservation goal of this part of the bond. We want to see projects that promote equity and recreation in Buncombe County, as well as that are accessible to the county and the people in our county. We want to see that these projects can be feasibly developed within that bond timeline. So as Thomas was saying, this is, you know, 7 to 10 years that we have to spend this money. And so if a project if the project that, or the part of the project that is asking for these funds can't be accomplished within the restrictions of the bond, like that's something for us to consider. Obviously, being efficient and effective in how you manage costs, but also leveraging multiple funding sources. Both of these kind of speak to our desire to make these bond funds go as far as possible. And to the degree that we can tap into other funding sources for these projects, that will make that happen. And then aligning with county plans and needs. So this can be, we have our comprehensive plan, which has been in the works, and there's been a lot of conversations around that. So that's one plan that we would probably look to. Also the greenways and parks and recreations plans that are potentially in the works. Those are all the types of longer term and larger strategies that we want to be looking to and making sure that these projects fall into that. We're trying to be more intentional with how these funds are spent, as opposed to just kind of willy-nilly throwing money around and not thinking how they fit into the larger picture of open space and specifically passive recreation in Buncombe County. So, and we leave it at county plans / needs because we also want to make that flexible. Obviously, some of the plans that are in place are older. For example, the current Greenways plan is from 2012, right? Yeah, so that's like over 10 years old now. There's been a lot has happened in that time frame, so we recognize that there's going to be needs and priorities that have developed that might not be captured in those plans. So we wanted to leave the flexibility in there to be able to address those newer priorities. And then the final one that our team has come up with is that plan for long-term maintenance and management, and making sure that the project proposals are thinking about that. But our activity is I want to work with all of you and engage you in thinking through these ideas, but also what's missing. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive list of potential characteristics of a great project. And there's probably things that you guys have thought of that we haven't yet. And so our activity, if you guys are ready for it, is we have kind of posters around the room with these different characteristics. We'd love you guys to add your ideas or your questions. What nuances are we missing in these these are very high levels, so there's a lot of nuance that's not captured here. So what is that nuance? Also, are these the right characteristics to be thinking about, or is there additional ones that aren't included yet? But before we stop for the activity, I do want to keep this conversation going, as well as if you have questions about these specific characteristics that we've thought of, or about the passive recreation generally. Any questions? Thoughts? Comments?
Lots of ideas.
Well, if you want to talk them out, we can. We have a small group and we still have plenty of time. So.
Yeah, I'm kind of curious on going back to the maintenance cost aspect of it. If a private organization applies for funding for land acquisition and access to the public, but they're in possibly a few years of maintenance, but it is a nonprofit entity that doesn't have any donors backing it. Like, in my mind, the only place that money is gonna come from is from user fees. Like, do we have a way to prevent, because like as a county resident and taxpayer, I've already paid to use this piece of land. Is there a way to like, I wouldn't wanna say like disqualify something like that, but to kind of guide a project in a way of being like, this isn't gonna be a pay for use kind of situation?
My initial thought of that, if I could just say, is one of the things we're talking about is it accessible to all of Buncombe County? And so one of those things could, potential, as you're looking at accessibility, is a higher rating for free public access, or, you know, having some type of a qualifying question. So there's two ways to get to that, because you can have if it's deemed across the community that is of the utmost important, a qualifying question could be, would this property be free and accessible? And if the answer is yes, then it could move forward. If the answer is no, we could choose to say no. But again, that would come out of conversations that we have here for priorities, and what the community as a whole feels the same way, which may very well be the case.
Yeah, okay.
I would also say that in the LCAP's process for reviewing land conservation projects from our land trust partners, and part of the scoring is the scoring of the entity themselves. So have we had a good track record with SAC or with Riverlink or with Conserving Carolina? And that's rated, and that impacts their ranking in projects moving forward. And I think, again, this is all to be determined, you know, through a process, a public process. It seems to me like we would want qualified organizations, and maybe there is a minimum of endowment or a minimum, you know, I don't know how we would qualify them, but we need success here, you know?
One idea for that that's relevant to land trust would be like check the box, are you an accredited land trust? And that just might be a way to quantify that.
You can utilize your financial statements, get my values and all that to do something.
Though I wonder, I'm thinking out loud, but I could also see potential for if, you know, a project proposal from a nonprofit does say, we have a partner, like a volunteer organization that would be interested in helping with the long-term management or maintenance. I think that's something that would also be good to potentially see, is how these collaborations could allow organizations that might not have the funds to pay for it out of pocket, but have a partnership that can help with that work too.
Yeah, I wonder, like, a broad question about like, what's your long-term management plan for this property, and how do you ensure that it's going to be able to remain accessible, and you have the staff power or the volunteer power or the like financial capacity to continue management in the long term.
I'm guessing that you'll probably reference other grant applications for, because I know that a lot of these questions, I write so many grant applications. And fortunately, we don't have to reinvent the wheel, or you don't have to reinvent the wheel too much.
Yeah. And to that point, we have already been talking with different counties and municipalities who have similar programs and looking at their grant application processes, looking at the evaluation criteria they use, and that has definitely informed how we've been thinking about it as well. And the next step, and won't go all the way back to the beginning, but in that kind of time or that process for the bond, the next step for this is to go into that application development, and I think that's a great point as well, as we should be referencing other applications and not trying to build everything from scratch.
One criteria that I feel like is missing from some of the sources of funding that at least land trusts apply to regularly, that this could maybe fill a gap, is the scenic significance. And not to say that there's anything wrong with the grant applications that don't take that into consideration, but I'm thinking of both the scenic impact that the project has in the community, like looking into the property, as well as the scenic opportunities on the property. Looking, like providing, I guess, a scenic experience for the user.
But also, I mean, you all might be capturing this with the accessibility to all residents, but connectivity is such a huge thing, so that we can connect different pockets that kind of haven't been activated and allow residents to run somewhere, or bike somewhere, or to connect to a larger piece of a trail system or a greenway. I mean, I think connectivity should be pretty high up on the list.
And that would probably go into accessible to all.
Yeah.
On that note, how do we want to treat a project that could potentially fall within the Greenways master plan? Say it's gonna be a nature preserve with the environmental preservation component. It seems like we have these different buckets and they're not capped on them.
Yeah.
But funds from this could technically be used to preserve a piece of land and give the easement for the greenway through. For clarity purposes, how would we want to present that?
We've had discussion about like,
Yeah.
could we bonus if you hit 2 buckets, if it's a greenway and, you know. Well, so we've been like talking about how could you structure that? And it's been a little bit of a difficult question, because we're saying you can't apply to more than 1 bucket. And so,
Well, you can apply to more.
or excuse me, you can't be
receive
funded,
excuse me.
yes. So, and I think it's
There's been a lot of
challenging.
internal.
Yeah.
debate.
Challenging.
And I think
Yeah,
part of the issue is, obviously, like a project like that, it's exciting that it would potentially hit multiple buckets, but also we don't want to end up having all of the funding available going towards the same 1 or 2 projects, just because they applied for Greenways funding and got that because they scored really high, and then they applied for passive recreation and got that because they scored really high, and then they applied for conservation, or probably not in that order, but like they applied for all 3 and it's a good project, so it scored really high for all 3. That would obviously mean that we have less funding available for other projects. So it's definitely been a conversation that we're trying to iron out, I guess.
Well, there's also the issue that the Greenway projects are not even gonna be up for consideration for another couple of years. So that if there is something that's just conservation with the possibility of Greenway connection, you know, that can be more immediate, and if it doesn't work out, then maybe it can come later when, after those first 2 projects are done.
I don't know if this would be a benefit or a negative, but I mean, you could just say, choose whichever bucket is your strongest. And then you get additional points if it also qualifies for one of the other buckets.
Is there any effort to, taking a look at this bond in the whole $30 million, is there an effort to regionally space these projects so that everybody gets a good bit?
Yes-ish.
Yeah,
So-
I mean, it's limited because
Yeah.
projects will only be what they are.
Well, and part of the goal of these kind of the county plans piece of this is like, there are other conversations in the county and looking at the bigger picture and understanding, you know, where are recreation and open space, how are they distributed throughout the county? And so we want to make sure that we are paying attention to those conversations. And I think part of the equity component also speaks to that as well, and that's something in the greenways process came up a lot, was there was a lot of discussion around how certain parts of the county felt that they didn't have these same opportunities for recreation that, you know, other parts of the county did, and that was a big component that came through in that equity and the accessibility conversation for greenways. And so I think that's something we're trying to address both with those components and with the county plan conversation. And it's something we're talking about internally too, is do we need potentially to look at a bigger picture of what open space, not just Parks and Rec and not just greenway, but open space broadly looks like, and conservation has their own plans as well. So what does the bigger picture look like across these different aspects of open space?
It's interesting, I'm just thinking about this concept, and it's a little bit like, for land trust planning, strategic planning, we prioritize things that are adjacent to large blocks of protected land. And this almost, I mean, really could be beneficial on both sides, but for it to be maybe fairly isolated would be actually a bonus, if it's filling in a desert, like park, desert, or open space recreation desert.
I think that's a really good question about size of project. I mean, so we talk about location because we want it accessible, we want people using it, and if you put it out where people have to have a car in order to get there or drive 30 minutes or whatever, maybe doesn't check that accessibility box. But what about a 20-acre parcel versus a 300-acre parcel, or you know, like how do we, there's different kinds of benefits that come with different size properties. And so I think that's an interesting thought. So location is one that comes to mind, but size also get different types of benefits, maybe. Or,
Not easy.
yeah. And the other thing I'll say too is this is the first go at a bond for us. It doesn't necessarily mean it's the last one. So we won't get everything done. And $30 million is in our personal bank accounts is a lot of money. In a public bank account, not so much. So we know there's limits on what is going to be achieved. And we know that we are not going to have a park in every park desert in the county at the end of this phase. So I think that's what makes it hard, because there's no guarantee there will be another bond. And so you got to do absolutely your best with what we have, while at the same time, you know, thinking, okay, we'll have opportunity to keep going, hopefully, in the future, should the voters make that decision.
We live in good projects. They do.
Exactly, yeah. And that's the pressure of it too, right?
Yeah.
Is to see success initially, so that, you know, opportunity continues in the future.
And I think equitable distribution of the funds is gonna have to be looked at as like kind of a whole pot. Just because you're just not gonna have certain project types in certain areas of the county. Like you're not gonna see a huge conservation easement in downtown Asheville.
Mhm.
So you're gonna have to look at it kind of the three separate pots and look and making sure we're like distributing them kind of throughout the county, not just every corner of the county have a passive recreation land park. It's just not gonna be that. So I take on it. The Greenway is the same thing. There's a very kind of limited bucket of projects for us to choose from. So it's just not, there's just not gonna be all of our corners. So,
I do think it will be tricky with the application to balance that connectivity piece, because that's come out so much.
Yeah.
And everything we heard with the addressing the desert and making sure the point values aren't canceling each other out. And so maybe it sort of makes like a flow chart from it's either addressing the desert or it's addressing connectivity, and there's ways to get points for both, but one doesn't negate the other. Does that make sense? That might not even be a concern, but for me, I'm like, if I were trying to pass this test, how many points do I want to get to win? I would think that would be some careful wording.
Yeah, and I think how we structure the weighting of criteria, once we have criteria fully developed, will definitely play into making sure that just because a project does really well in one criteria and not another, doesn't automatically disqualify it or vice versa. So I do want to pause the conversation just because we only have 15 minutes left and I wanted to give you guys time to express your thoughts on these posters. But there will also be a lot more opportunity to continue the conversation as well. On your seats, we have a flyer for our public meeting for next week, which is gonna be a very similar conversation, but with the general public. And then additionally, we have a flyer for an online survey that you can complete that gets into some of what we've talked about today, but some additional questions that we are curious to hear how you think as well. And we also want to ask if you guys can share these with your networks and with your organizations, especially that public meeting as well. We'd love to see a large group of people there, and as many people as can fill out the survey is always helpful too. With that, I will pause so you can add.
Oh, that's a quick question. I would love to know what stakeholder groups are represented here.
Oh, yes, great. That's a great one. Thank you. We should have done introductions at the beginning, but we can do introductions now, so please.
My name's Kyle Shute, I work at Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy, my title is Land Protection Associate, so I work on prospective projects primarily. Doing both conservation easements, as well as fee acquisitions and partnering on park stuff, so.
My name is Michelle Pugliese. I work for Southern Appalachian Highlands Conservancy also, land protection director, and I work on land acquisitions and conservation easements. Also working with our state and federal and local partners, and do strategic planning and applying for grants and.
I'm Natalie Beckman. I am the executive director of Pisgaria Sorba. We are the nonprofit that maintains, we've adopted about 100 miles of trail in the Pisgah Ranger District. Mainly, that's our main land manager. And maintain those trails, also take on projects that reroute environmentally and sustainable trails and rehabilitate trails. So I do all of it. I'm the only employee.
I'm Kevin Conrica. I am a Parks and Rec Advisory Board member, and I'm the chair of the Passive Rec Subcommittee.
I'm Pam Coates. I'm Riverlinks Land Resources Manager. Pretty much echo what you guys said for what I do. Yeah, conservation easements, project development, grant writing, just like that. Yeah.
Well, I'm Ann Babcock, and I'm on Parks and Recreation Advisory Board, and also Connect Rock.
Thank you, and thank you for that idea, Ann. I've noted that next time. Introductions are really good. So yeah, we have markers. We can add ideas to posters. The one for additional what's missing are over here on this whiteboard. There's 2 blank ones.
Oh, and Carl Silverstein, our executive director, is who was on Zoom.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Carl, let us know if you want us to write anything down. Carl, actually, I believe we can hear you if you wanted to speak. We can't see you, but we can hear you.
Hi, I'm Carl. I work with Kyle and Michelle, and they described well what we do.
Thank you, Carl. Thank you for joining. Why'd you open that door?
I know, this room gets a little like. Do we have this like digitally that if people wanted to send this out to an email blast or?
Yeah, so Angelica is actually.
Gonna ask if I can share that.
Oh, yes. She's got an email toolkit set up for the process.
Oh, there's a.
Save myself.
Yeah. Other than just saying thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, and I had some more talking.
Surprisingly, the Sharpies are the least expensive marker option.
Well, we had, at the department head meeting, they had those scented,
Oh,
like the blueberry and the.
Like
it was
little
like,
kid.
Oh, God. Really, the one that smelled the most was the licorice one. And it was like, oh.
I always remember Sharpies being so expensive.
I know.
So I was like, oh, they're actually the least expensive.
I think markers are a good touch.
The scented marker?
It's a good touch.
God, it was hilarious. It takes you back to like your childhood. Remember when they had these? Everybody was
We're all
passing
just
them around.
snapping them?
What do you think this one is? Oh, yeah, I think that's.
I hate to know
Yeah.
how many brain cells I killed.
I know, scented markers.
Only you guys want those like local nature smell.
Yeah.
Honey, Roselia.
Here's apple blossom.
Yeah. Well, everybody was like, what's the brown one? Nobody wanted to smell brown one.
Oh, I remember always liking whatever the brown.
Yeah, the brown was, I thought it was cinnamon. That's what I thought.
That's what I
But,
thought it was too.
yeah, but people were like, I don't smell anything. I was like, oh, I smell cinnamon. No,
I always thought it was.
well, what does a blueberry smell like? Really? Like,
This smells like space.
Whatever
you know,
blueberry pie smells like.
it is, like, what does it smell like? I don't know. What if watermelon